Regional economic integration remains a viable development strategy for Africa. Now, it can facilitate efficiencies in production, investment and trade, and of course, enhance development outcomes. As we celebrate Africa Day tomorrow here on CNBC Africa, and of course, across Africa, we're joined by Lynette Chen, the CEO of the NEPAD Business Foundation, to look at opportunities for integration in the SADC region. Thanks so much for joining us, Lynette. So let's take a step back, because you've been with the Business Foundation for 6 years now, since it was founded. You've obviously found a kind of, a motivation for being behind a foundation like this, which is very much tied to the Africa agenda or the SADC agenda. Tell us, what's your assessment of the progress that has been made by the foundation?
Well, certainly there's been a lot of progress being made within NEPAD, which is the Continental Framework for Development on the continent, and it is actually 11 years young. So whilst the NEPAD Business Foundation has existed actually since the inception of NEPAD, we have seen a lot of progress being made. Obviously, to coordinate 53 country governments on implementing a continental strategy on agriculture or infrastructure, etc., does take a lot of planning. And as I said, implementation, more harmonization and cooperation has been certainly more forthcoming from the national governments to implement these large-scale projects.
How tough is it for you? Because you ultimately really are trying to be the cog or the bridge between the private sector and governments. How tough is it for you to communicate what is needed to ultimately enhance the business operating environment?
So it is a challenge. I think that traditionally the way that institutional frameworks or Pan-African institutions have worked is generally that the governments implement or develop policies, and private sector literally has to fit in and adhere to those policies. What we're trying to do by being sort of the central coordinator between government and private sector is to get a business voice into the policy formations, and to work and partner with governments in understanding that all policies, while well intended, may not actually be conducive for growth. Particularly for investment. And so just having clear communication, dialogue, and partnering around brainstorming new and innovative ideas and economic models for Africa, I think there is a lot more cooperation between both sectors to achieve goals as in the best interests of economic growth.
So while there are small milestones, I mean, ultimately, if you look at it, Africa is still not trading with itself, pretty much, is the bottom line. So how is the approach towards looking at regional integration shifting? Is it just going to be a matter of time, because you refer to NEPAD being 11 years young? It's still going to take time to reduce the barriers to trade, or do you think that the approach needs to shift fundamentally?
I think the approach is starting to shift tremendously, particularly, for example, if you look at the formation of the tripartite alliance between the RECs of COMESA, SADC and EAC. They have three very focused objectives. One is to look at cross-border infrastructure. The second is to look at industrialization along these corridors. And the third is to look at harmonization of policies, which ranges from trade policies to customs, etc. And so I think there is more of a concerted effort to do so.
Let's look at some aspects of this. Agriculture is becoming more and more of a focus when it comes to the commercialization of agriculture, if you could call it that, and modernization, and the potential that it represents for sectors. What type of integration opportunities are there right now to really harmonize, agricultural developments in each of the countries?
So there are a couple of initiatives. For example, under the NBF, we have a program called Removing the Barriers to Investment in Agriculture, which is really looking along investments in agriculture along the Beira corridor, which spans Mozambique, Malawi and Zambia. Some of the policy issues that we're addressing through one of our working groups is to look at the seed harmonization policy. So whilst countries within SADC and COMESA have signed this regional seed harmonization policy, at a national level, the seeds are still being blocked by customs officials from being imported and exported across borders. And that is...
And what are the reasons for that?
Well, these policies signed at a regional level are signed, with good intentions by the national governments. However, it's not actually trickled down into the people that are actually working at the border posts. And so we...
what's the rationale behind blocking some of these things? I mean, do we know that, or is it just because they think it's kind of harmful to let those, that in?
There's various reasons for it. One is probably that the government officials at the border posts are not informed and not capacitated and trained on how to adjust their local policies, their forms, etc., and just to get an understanding of what their policy implementation means. Second of all, there is some resistance from local seed producers who see that importation of other seeds might be detrimental to their own markets. So there are various reasons, but I think it's really about education and awareness, because once you allow seeds to cross borders, the quality of the seed improves, it increases production, and of course greater economic growth in the agriculture sector.
Do you think this is going to be a major area of progress for NEPAD and for the NBF specifically focusing on agriculture?
Agriculture is one of the, and I would say actually the second biggest economic growth sector in Africa at the moment. So the first scramble in Africa was for its minerals, the second big scramble now is for agriculture and land. So definitely it is very important that country governments define criteria for investment in the agriculture sector to prevent what's happened with the minerals, exporting raw materials, etc. Agro-processing and development of the local value chain needs to be part and parcel of the investment strategies of any companies investing in a country.
So businesses that you represent in the private sector, are they wanting to invest in agriculture? Do they need regional integration in order to make those business models work?
Definitely. There is definitely huge interest, particularly large companies like Senvest and Afgri have, and Imperial Logistics, for example, have expanded extensively in the last 3 to 4 years into other countries. There is massive opportunities, yet there are still some barriers and red tape. For example, in Malawi recently, where the export permits were basically cancelled on a day's notice without any explanation. And so those kinds of barriers and therefore important.
Those kind of unexpected shocks, you could call
exactly. Which has detrimental effects because, trying to work with government officials that sometimes can take months or weeks to reinstate those export permits. And therefore, these platforms that the NBF has created between government and private sector is important to communicate and get a common understanding of the detriment to the agriculture sector if these barriers are not removed.
Lastly, what is the thought process around private sector involvement? And I mean involvement in terms of the initiation of ideas, the initiation of policy, the kind of talking around round tables around specific sectors and issues. When is the private sector getting involved, and when should it get involved?
Traditionally, private sector gets involved at the end. So, I think traditionally governments see that in infrastructure projects they're designed, developed, and private sector is really just the implementers or contractors. And what we're trying to enforce is that private sector gets involved in the early part of the discussions to ensure that policies that are formulated are conducive for growth.
Is there space at the table for private sector right now?
I think increasingly we have been invited. Certain country governments are more open than others to inviting private sector to participate and discuss innovative ideas. There, for example, Zambia is an example. South African government is quite open for private sector involvement. And slowly I think it is changing. They understand the critical role that private sector has to play, and also bringing along private sector expertise, skills and resources to these projects means that through partnerships, government does not need to bear the responsibilities of these large-scale projects on their own.